Bison. American buffalo. The number of bison in the wild was estimated at about 30 million individuals. But when the Europeans occupied the Americas, they committed the largest animal extermination in all of history. Until 1884, its population in the wild reached 300 individuals. In a famous picture in the late 19th century, I depicted the two hunters standing on a huge, pyramid-like pile of bison skulls. So, what is the story? Why did the US Army eliminate python? Bison is a large type of cattle. It was widespread in huge numbers in the pastures and grasslands extending from Alaska to North America, to the Gulf of Mexico in the far south. It was considered the largest mammal found on the North American continent. The indigenous people of the Americas relied mainly on it for many needs. You could say it was like a treasure to them. First, they ate its meat and used its summer skin to make tents. As for winter skin, it was used for winter clothing. Even bones and horns were used to make tools. It was multiplying in huge numbers. Its numbers in the wild ranged from 30 million to 60 million individuals. But despite this, the indigenous people did not hunt it in large quantities. They hunted from it according to their needs. They treated it as an important part of their culture. Problems began to appear with the appearance of the Europeans, as usual, in the 1950s. The Europeans had a firm grip on the Americas and settled them. The United States declared its independence decades ago, but despite that, the indigenous population was still present, and among them was a group present in large numbers in Central and Western America, specifically in the interior Plains region. He called them Plains Indians. By the way, the word Indian is just European arrogance. These are called local people. But at the time of the discovery of the Americas by the Europeans, they claimed that they had reached India, so they called them Indians. They did not know that this was a new land. The Plains Indians were a disease to the Europeans because the Europeans wanted to gather all the indigenous people in the region and imprison them in a small village where they lived. Then the Europeans plundered and stole the lands just as they had stolen the ones before them, and they had something called the dream of American expansion towards the West. This is their destiny as they colonize these lands. But every time the indigenous people tried to invade the plains areas, they prevented them, fought them, and inflicted great losses on them. Especially since the topography of these areas is complex, and the Plains Indians are their preservers. They were an armed group and were good at riding horses, and the Americans at that time were still emerging from a civil war. That's why they thought of a very wicked idea. In order to achieve their goals. Translate text with your camera. In 1974, they issued a decision stating the right and legality of hunting bison. Because at that time it was illegal, but the US president at the time, Ulysses Grande, objected to the decision and annulled it. He told them, whoever wants to hunt will hunt. In fact, the Americans at that time began to promote the idea of recreational hunting for those who wanted to hunt bison for entertainment. They even began sending invitations to athletes and celebrities in Europe to hunt bison in America as if it were a celebration. Thousands of pythons were being killed on a daily basis, to the point that in 1876 there was a hunter. A European alone killed 5,800 bison in 2 months, meaning approximately 100 bison every day. The issue did not stop here. The Americans noticed that the leather industry was in great demand in Europe. Therefore, they returned to the idea of benefiting from bison hide, and this is what increased poaching operations. One of the most horrific practices that were committed was that the hunters would shoot the bison and then take the skin and throw the meat in the ground until it rots and no one benefits from it. In fact, some hunters used to put poison in the meat so that no one would eat it, and if a wolf came to eat it, it would also die, and they would take the wolf's fur. They also leave his body, and of course if any of the indigenous people wanted to eat him, he would face the same fate. The Plains Indians saw the Americans killing their main animal in the beginning, and they did not understand what was happening and why they were doing this, and also why the Europeans stopped attacking them, but with time the vision became clear, but unfortunately the indigenous people discovered it too late, and the numbers of bison were very reduced, and they did not find anything to eat, and in the late 80s, since the 19th century, the number of bison in the wild has ranged from 300 to 500 individuals, because some statistics say that they have reached 100 individuals. Thus, the vile strategy succeeded and they defeated the Plains Indians after the Plains Indians were deprived of their food resources. They were forced to submit to the Americans due to hunger. They left their lands and went to reside in areas from which they were not allowed to leave. In return, the people who occupied the land provided them with food and entered, and then European companies took over the lands. They established tourist and entertainment parks in the places where the Plains Indians used to live. One of the ironic things is that after the Americans eliminated the Plains Indians and limited their residency, they began to say that hunting white animals is prohibited, and if their numbers decreased, they then said that they would restore this animal's rights, and they played the role of morality police, as usual, and they began. They prevent hunting and arrest anyone who hunts animals illegally. In the end, they transformed the bison from an animal that reproduced in huge numbers to an animal in danger of extinction, but fortunately some wealthy Americans were keeping some bison animals on their farms, so the American government took them with those who were living in the wild and placed them in large reserves and began to care for them for many years until their number became increase again. Currently, their numbers have reached about 500,000 individuals. Of course, in relation to their original numbers, this is nothing. However, in the end, they were saved from the threat of extinction, and then groups of them were released into the plains in order to integrate with the wildlife again. The bison problem was somewhat resolved, but as for the problem of the indigenous population, there is no one to talk about it. And here we have finished our episode.